Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru. Welcome to Yogananda podcast. We are in chapter 12, part 18, and we have a full house today. We got Lauren, Priyank, and Chris. I hope you guys are all doing well. Yeah, I think I don't know. We don't have to talk about each time where everyone is, but we are in four different places this time, which is great. Northern Ireland, London, and Buenos Aires, and Austria. Yeah, we are covering big parts of the globe this
Indeed.
time.
Priyank being in
Yeah,
Northern Ireland.
yeah. It's also reversed roles a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I should say actually, we talked about it briefly before we started. I've been in Buenos Aires for a couple of weeks, leaving in 1 week's time. But I was really, really pleased to see the SRF in Buenos Aires. It's a beautiful building, really lovely atmosphere with like 4-hour sessions on Saturdays with four different sessions. So yeah, great organization done by all there. Really, really nice. They had a lovely curtain as well, which I enjoyed for the last couple of weeks. So yeah, really pleased to get back into the community because it's feels like it's been a while. So thanks to the
Which cosmic chant did they do in Spanish?
Oh, that's a good question. And I love you. I forget the name. You put me on the spot.
In the Temple of Silence. In the
Temple of Silence, thank you. Was the last one. I forget the one before.
And what is it in Spanish?
The name?
Yeah, the song, the chant.
I could probably give like a guess. It was
Go,
Portuguese.
Michael. What is it? Go, Michael.
Or like something like Templo del Silencio, something like that.
Yeah, Silencio, yeah. Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Good job, Mike.
Well, I don't know. It could be completely wrong, and then everyone who's Spanish is going to comment on it. You're wrong.
But it was awesome. The person they had, conducting had this really strong voice and boomed it out and was really, really passionate. So loved it.
What do you think about how do they sound in Spanish? Is it like,
worked.
Yeah?
Yeah, it worked. Obviously I was singing it in my mind, so it was, it felt quite different for me, but it definitely had a nice flow to it. Yeah.
Nice. Let's get into, before we get into this episode, let's summarize the previous one, part 17 of chapter 12. Chris, do you want to give us a summary of that?
Sure. So in this part of the chapter, we saw the tire kickers, what we deemed the tire kickers of the ashram, the various folks that would visit the hermitage, the professors, philosophers, the lawyers, the scientists that came to the hermitage to talk to Sri Yukteswar, and they really expected something quite different to what was there in reality. They expected an unorthodox religious person, but they got somebody who's much more of a scholar than they were, it seems. So we talked about various topics of pride, of judgment from the Bhagavad Gita. We talked about a couple examples that really we were given to learn from a chemist and a scholar that visited. And we had a few nice readings in there on what God itself could be thought of and defined as. So yeah, it was a nice part of the chapter where it very politely sort of shined the light on maybe some hypocrisies in the human psyche. So yeah, very, very learned part of the book.
Very nice. Yeah, and we kind of continue in a similar topic this time, and it's Sri Yukteswar. He makes a remark that is, he basically says that book learning by itself is not that useful. He says, do not confuse understanding with a larger vocabulary. So he means it's really important that the knowledge of scriptures, which he's talking about when you read scriptures, you should not just memorize them or read them over and over again, but there has to be some process of absorption of the knowledge that is in those scriptures. Frank?
True. And the larger vocabulary bit, I must admit to be guilty of that. I remember when I started seriously reading books, I always kept a little log of all the words that I didn't know, and it was quite a big log. And I'd go back and try and figure out if I could remember what they meant, and often I didn't. So much so that I got obsessed with like dictionaries and apps that do define really quickly and things like that. But obviously, could have spent my time, I think, better with was it understanding rather than.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like just reading the sentence, it poses some questions on its own, doesn't it? I myself, for me, English is my second language, and I use the autobiography a lot to learn English myself. And it wasn't the easiest book to learn English with, because it's really not like your beginner's English in there. It's really there's some big words in there that I had to look up and remembering them, and they are really useful to express myself when I talk. But at the same time, this doesn't mean I gained any spiritual understanding just by learning vocabulary. I think this is the point that you made, Priyank, right? And this is kind of what Yukteswar is remarking here as well. And he says that sacred writings, that they are beneficial to stimulate the inward desire, but they have to be read very slowly and stanza by stanza in a sacred way, and not in a intellectual way. So it's not very intuitive, because when we study for a university test, that's not the way we would read it.
You know, I think if I remember correctly, I recall being very relieved when I read this sentence for the first time, because this is how I would read things. I read very slowly, and end up, phasing out. I wonder if you all did something like this, where it's the cousin of daydreaming, really, but you do sort of visualize and try to conceptualize what it is you're what it is you're trying to read. And I always thought, oh, I'm so lazy that I can't focus. But when I read this, I thought, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't be so hard on myself, because I would rather read something, and if it's so significant, like makes me really want to think and meditate on it. It's apparently a good thing. So to those people who might be in the same boat, I wondered if you guys had that, because it took me a while to get through some of the readings. You don't want to read it quickly, because it's every sentence is like an explosion of activity, really, a revelation.
I still do that. Get that, Chris? I especially God Talks with Arjuna. I've started it again 3 or 4 times, and it's only this time that I've made it over to the second book. Now I'm in the second book, and I've read so many. I've probably read the Bhagavad Gita in 4 different translations and 4 different authors, like the whole book in their translations. But Guruji's translation, like I just get completely lost, and then I have to go back. And sometimes I read the same paragraph like 5 times, and I'm thinking, am I getting this? Am I getting this? Am I getting this? And it's such a process. But if we really did it to the extent that's being described here, and to the extent that we are taught to do in lessons reading groups, like the Bhagavad Gita, and we have lessons reading classes in centers around the world, we literally, in an hour session, you only get through 1 or 2 pages, if that. and you spend, each person reads it very slowly, perhaps twice sometimes, and then you just meditate. And no one says how long the meditation should be. So if it's a particularly profound one, then it could end up being a very long meditation. And how it's really challenging, because how do you finish the book?
Yeah.
I've got this thing where I want to finish it, but it just won't ever happen with this depth of knowledge.
Yeah, I must say with the lessons and also the Gita commentary, it's the same for me, that when I just sit down and it's some books are like a page turner where you want to read more and more and more, and I feel like with the Gita I read a page, and what I really want to do is read that page again to actually understand what I just read, because it's so much information, and my ability to absorb it is just not great enough. The autobiography is a different book, because I feel like it has multiple layers. There's like one layer that you can just read and you just want to know what's happening in Yogananda's life, but then there is deeper layers that if you read it again, you suddenly find something that you didn't know was there before.
Yeah, I was going to say this. Have you ever opened a lesson book up and you can't remember, was that on page 29 or 31 or 30? Okay, I'll start here, just make sure. And then you read it and you're taking these insights, and it's oh wow, it's so great. And then you realize like 2 or 3 paragraphs in, oh hey, hold on, I read this like yesterday or the day before, and then you realize, oh wow, I'm taking a whole different meaning from this same thing. The same thing that I've read, and I took one meaning from it, and it was a very beautiful thing. Like I said, Mike, there's another layer to it, and then you read it again, there's another layer, so it just reveals itself too slowly. But that's a lot of Guruji's writings do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same with anything that you study. I don't know if you had an experience when you studied for university, because when I studied for a test, I wasn't really learning, I was memorizing. And so I summarized a large text to a smaller text, and then I would memorize chunks of this that I would think would be useful to know at a test. But then and it's a bit like I would be ChatGPT, you can ask me something and I can give you a generalized opinion on something. But if you go more drill down on my knowledge, you would find out that I actually don't know much. I just memorized a few things. And I don't know if you guys feel the same. That's what Yukteswar talks about here, I think, when he talks about undigested knowledge. So that means you have the information, you know what's in those lines, you know the words, but they have not sunk into your mind really to an extent that they become useful knowledge that you can then use.
And undigested knowledge, and also the fact he says earlier in that text, he says without what's it? Sacred writings are beneficial in stimulating desire for inward realization. And then it says that you've got to do it slowly, so one stands at a time, that you've got to read it slowly. And then it says otherwise you just get vanity and false satisfaction, and that, I think those two are quite important, vanity and false satisfaction, because often it's about, in intellectual circles as well, how many books have you read, what did you think of this book, and everyone's got to be part of that conversation. And then it's not it's not really great, is it? Knowledge for the sake of knowledge, just to puff yourself up or puff your ego up, and to think yourself as an intellect is pretty much what a lot of bookish people do, isn't it? And it's just really about satisfying your ego, isn't it? As opposed to really, if you just read one book really well, then forget the rest.
I wouldn't know anything about this, Priyank. So don't know what you're talking about, but this is exactly what you're right. This is exactly what Yukteswar warns about, and it makes sense. In the previous episode, we talked about those learned scholars that came, and they were talking about the placement of commas, and rather than actually understanding the meaning. So it makes sense in that context. I found a section in Man's Eternal Quest. It's called "The Lord's Infinite Power to Sustain You." But before that, Chris.
So yeah, I was gonna ask, like, what do you guys think this is? Like, why is this so common? Like, we all laugh because it's so familiar, right? So this book smart thing is so familiar. Whether you're book smart yourself or know people that are book smart, or we just have lived this in this world, and it was the same, looks to be the same 100+ years ago. So we can't really blame it on today's modern age of school, the way the schools are set up or whatever it might be. Why do you think this is? Do you think, like, I throw it out there, could it be the philosophies are different, where we don't see life as a continuum? It's like a YOLO, you only live once kind of approach, and it's a scramble to get to whatever seemingly sort of top of the pile that there might be in society. Whereas if you really thought, okay, I'm infinite soul, I'm here just to learn and really truly understand and digest everything around me, rather than try to scoff everything in and rush things. Do you think that might be somewhere at its core, that philosophy? Or is there something else?
That also, I think it would have been even worse back in the days of, the 20s and 30s that he's referring to, 1920s that he's referring to here. Because right now, being bookish and all this book knowledge is not secondary, but there's other forms of knowledge, especially with, like, in terms of TV and documentaries and all this media, social media, all these other forms of learning. Whereas back then it was literally just reading, wasn't it? It was just books. There was no podcasts back then. But I think it's also, Chris, similar to nowadays in some circles, which car do you drive is considered, people look at what car you're driving, they look at what clothes you're wearing, and in this sense, in some circles they'll look at not how many books, but what books are you reading, and that kind of thing. So I think it's all along the same kind of lines. One's material in terms of success, and material pride in terms of, like, cars and house and where you live, and this is now intellectual pride and ego. It's all really, it's the same here. We can't really, it's both going to be hinder you in terms of your growth, isn't it? Either of those outlooks.
Quantity, not quality. It's the perception of, yeah.
One profession where this is important is being a teacher, because when you're a teacher, you should do more than just memorize what Lauren would know about this. I don't know.
I don't know.
Because at the end of the day, when that's a technique that is quite common, that in order to learn something better, you try to teach it to someone else, because that kind of helps you to actually know which parts you know well and which ones you don't, and fill the gaps. And Guruji talked about this as well, and there's a short paragraph from Man's Eternal Quest that we could read. The section is called "The Lord's Infinite Power Sustains You." Priyank, you want to start reading?
Sure. I was reluctant at first to become a teacher. The implications frightened me. A teacher has to be a shock absorber. The minute he becomes disturbed, he cannot help those who seek his aid. A true teacher has to love everybody. He has to understand humanity and to know God. But when Sri Yukteswar told me that my role in life was to be that of a teacher, I called on the Lord's infinite power to sustain me.
When I started to give lectures, I made up my mind that I would speak not by book learning, but by inner inspiration, holding the thought that behind my speech was the inexhaustible creative power. I have also utilized that power in other directions to help people in business and in many different ways. I have used mortal mind to reflect immortality. I did not say, Father, do it, but I want to do it, Father. You must guide me. You must inspire me. You must lead me.
This is Guruji's way. He's an avatar. He has probably options at his disposal that we don't.
So true. And you really feel it as well in terms of when you read, when you read the autobiography and you read other of his books. Certainly I do, because I've read different translations of the Bhagavad Gita, for example, and then I read Guruji's, and then there's so much more there, and more that's like really you have to dig quite a lot into your intuition and perception to get. But Guruji doesn't then stop there, because he sometimes quotes the other authors and books. And I remember when I was doing the virtual tour of Mount Washington, and you can do like Google Street View of Guruji's room. And I think there's also like a video, like someone's walking through or something along those lines. And I paused it once because the Guruji's bookshelf was on show, and he had so many different books from Indian philosophy and Indian epics, and different translations of the Gita, like Arnold's translation. And he does quote them. Like sometimes when Arnold has written something very eloquently, he'll quote his translation and he does so in various of the books. So it's quite nice that he doesn't just stick to his perceptions and his what he gleans from his how he's described it here, the inexhaustible creative power that he connects to, but he also brings in what others have beautifully articulated or felt as well.
I'm 100% convinced if Guruji was alive today, he would be very much using all the media possible to explore knowledge, and he often did back then. He often quotes scientific papers, he often quotes authors, and I think he would be doing the same with contemporary authors these days, where he's a truth seeker at the end of the day, right? And wherever he would find truth in the different books that he reads, he would quote it. So there is the right way to read scripture, and I think we got a hint from that when we go to a local center and we do a Gita or a Bible reading class. I'm sure most people who have been to a center have done this, where you read part of it and then you meditate on it for a while to absorb, and it's a very slow process. It's not fast, but it is a way to make it sink in. And Sri Yukteswar, he relates to one of his experiences that he had. He mentions a renowned teacher from East Bengal, and his name is Dabru Balaf. And Dabru Balaf, he has his own hermitage in the forest in East Bengal, and he uses a technique that used to be common in ancient India. And the way he describes it is, he had his disciples sitting around him. As I imagine it, everyone had their own version of the Bhagavad Gita in front of them, and they would just look at a passage of the Gita, and he said they would look at a passage for half an hour, and then they closed their eyes, and then another hour slipped away. So this is the amount of time they would give themselves to absorb just a single passage of the Gita, which is probably like a short paragraph or a stanza. And then there's a dialogue that he mentions here, where he says, then after they meditated again for another hour, then he speaks and he says, "Do you understand the stanza now?" And there's one of the disciples that speaks up and he says, "Yes, sir." I guess he was thinking, okay, so 2.5 hours, it's enough now. Let's move on to the next one. I got it. And this was not what Dabru Balav was expecting. Dabru Balav wanted them to have a different attitude on this. We continue. He then says, "No, you have not fully understand it." And then he says, "Seek the spiritual vitality that has given these words the power to rejuvenate India century after century." And then they passed another hour in silence. And then he turned to Sri Yukteswar, and then he asked him a question. But before, Priyank?
Yeah, does anyone else here feel that or remember the instructions on how to read the lessons here? Because if you, in the new lessons, the preface edition, if you read the preface, and also the old lessons, I think it was in probably the first introductory lesson. But I remember in that he had, he basically he talked about this whole concept that he's referring to in this little section of the book and autobiography, and he really went to town on this. He kind of went from like how, you know, really listening and really trying to understand and grasp the meaning is really, really important, and trying to get it into your mind and heart. And then he said, in this world where like you're barraged by senses and all that kind of stuff, it's really hard to stay focused and keep your attention. And he said that you really got to, you know, work hard to understand and to make it part of your life. And then the method of reading our lessons is that we read, because it's so complex, as I was saying about the God Talks with Arjuna, the lessons are probably in a similar, if not even a more profound vein, aren't they? And he's, with the lessons, you know, you're given, say, about 2 weeks to read the lesson before the next one comes. But if you do this, you may not make it. So he says, read the whole lesson once, even like don't stop, just read the whole thing again, and then do this method of reading like a paragraph at a time and meditating and reading the next paragraph, meditating, and keep doing that, to keep churning that. And then he says, now you can take the time to reflect after you've done those first 2 exercises, and you can make notes and make those practices into your daily life, and, you know, use your journal perhaps, and really work on it to make it. And then he says basically to stay devoted to the path and devoted to the learning, because it's essentially not going to be easy. But I really love that Guruji introduces this really profound method of spiritual study in the autobiography, but there's also a lot more to it, and you can get that in the lessons.
No, on a slightly different note, what we're doing, taking the autobiography of a yogi, going part by part, line by line, is a little bit of a meditation in some ways. We're really stripping it apart and taking every word and, you know, looking at the meaning, and it just occurred to me, actually, you know, that I bang on about 2-hour, 3-hour podcasts. I could easily listen to one, and, you know, I love podcasts and long format. It's probably because of this reason. You know, there's so much, you know, one criticism of fairly modern days politics and lots of different topics, is that it's sound bites. You take these big complex topics and you're expected to really understand what somebody has, what somebody's opinion on it is, or what they're trying to convey in a soundbite in 1 minute, 2 minutes on the news or something. And you can't really get that. You need to really pay something its due and listen to it for hours and hours until you get it. But yeah, it just occurred to me. So shout out to podcasts, long format. I'll fly the flag forever.
Good occurring, Chris, because that would then mean that, I listed 3 steps in the study of the lessons. The third one was to reflect and write down the truths that you've picked up upon, and journal and make those truths into your life, your outward life, and spiritualize your life essentially. And this is exactly what we're trying to do in the podcast, aren't we? We're really going to town on the teachings and bringing in different aspects of our lives and trying to implement those truths, as it were. So good stuff, Chris.
And we said when we started this podcast that we're really just scratching the surface of this book. And the autobiography, I think, is really a book that lends itself to the format that we're doing here. I don't think we could do this on the Bhagavad Gita really, because it would be a whole different story, because there's I think it's more densely packed with lessons and wisdom that it would be very difficult to do the podcast.
So
and I don't think it's also not meant for this. Yes.
What about everyone that's seeking a podcast on God Talks with Arjuna? And now you're saying it's definitely not going to happen.
Yeah, I don't
stop us from wrong.
I would have my doubts. Let's put it that way. Let me register some concerns here. Yeah.
Noted.
Yeah. Yeah. So, continuing the story, when Dabrubalov talked to Sri Yukteswar, he asked him if he would know the Bhagavad Gita, and he said, "No, sir, not really." That's the answer I would give too, of course. Even though I've read, well, I don't know. I don't even know if I can say that I read the whole Bhagavad Gita. I read a lot of the Bhagavad Gita, but I keep jumping around. There's definitely in the first book, I think I would say I've read everything, and in the second book, maybe not. But even the parts that I read, I wouldn't say I know them or I know everything about them, because it's very, it's so packed with lessons in there that it's very, very difficult to remember everything, and understand is a whole different story as we're learning in this chapter. So this answer, it impresses Dabrubalov. He said, "Hundreds have replied to me differently." And he smiled. That made him smile, because Sri Yukteswar was showing this humility. He wasn't saying, "Oh, I've read the book, I know everything." Yes, Prem?
And this really contrasts to the previous chap who said, who understands this? And he's like, "Yes, sir, I understand." Like, can you imagine the brazenness of this poor fellow that thought to put his pride, put everything out there? Like, because if Guruji asked this question, you dare not venture to say, "Yes, I understand." But this guy has. But I was wondering if he probably did it just to be part of the ongoing Leela, just to have fun with his master and life, just so he could be made an example out of. But Sri Yukteswar is not obviously in that category. He's got a much larger purpose.
I have to say, this section of the autobiography is one of my standout moments. It's one of my most memorable ones as well, because I remember when I read it and I just felt so inspired at the time, because there is an avatar, a great saint, a great one, right, who admits that no, I still haven't really dived to the true depths of the Gita, even though I've read it so many times. And it really sort of spoke to that, inner longing for the depths of something. So I remember when I was reading this for the first time, thinking like, yeah, you really can never get to the real heart, or you can, but you've really got to dive deep. So I find it really inspiring still, even reading it. I look forward to this part, so I'm glad we're here now.
And in some ways it contradicts what we are looking for. We talked about this earlier, that we read a book to then brag about having read it, right? To our book class, Priyank, right? To our book club, we say we read this book before, and then we brag about, especially like this part and this part, right? This is kind of how we usually read books. And
I've never been able to do it. I've never read many books. I would love to be able to say that. Yeah.
Good on you. Good on you.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Don't. And Dabrubalov, he mentions this here in a way that I didn't realize before. So he says, if you're wasting your time on creating your outer display of scriptural wealth, right? So you are actually trying to memorize certain bits of it so you can later quote them and prove to people that you read it and how well you understood it. That time should be spent on inwardly absorbing it with meditation and the technique he described. So you're basically not even doing the right process.
Indeed. What is a phenomenal response, isn't it? Really one that makes you think. And just before he said this, he smiled at Sri Yukteswar. And I read something into that, because he didn't smile at the previous person that said, yes, I understand. But to Sri Yukteswar's baffled response, he smiled. And I thought that smile is clearly a blessing, right? So it would appear that even a smile from Guruji is a blessing. And it's so nice because we've got so many pictures of our gurus smiling at us, especially Paramahansa Yogananda. We've got so many pictures, and we can use readings such as this, and then in other walks of our life, just remember the smile and the benefit and the blessing. And I remember in one of the sections of the autobiography, he says, even just looking at Lahiri Mahashai's picture and saying his name invokes the spiritual blessing. So this is quite nice. But I really love what Dabrubalov was told Sri Yukteswar here. It's just so moving, isn't it? And really inspiring for us to spend much more time going deeper in our learning and our study of the lessons and teachings.
And I wonder sometimes when I hear this process, I definitely have to say I don't fully understand what is happening here, because, like I said, if I study for a test, I would then look at it and try to memorize part of this text. But this is not what's going on here. We're absorbing through meditation. So I think at some level it will be praying to God to understand this stanza and giving us this wisdom. I feel like something like this is going on. I might be wrong, but this is kind of the feeling I get of how this would work under the hood. Yeah. So Sri Yukteswar then said or Yogananda said that Sri Yukteswar, he implemented this same method in his own hermitage. He found this very important, and he says a sentence that is I found very, very interesting, and it says, "Wisdom is not assimilated with the eyes, but with the atoms," which is, yeah. So let that sink in.
Yeah, and it's really applicable even from a scientific perspective, because not even this, it is a scientific perspective, because all of our body, every cell has memory. So your nose remembers, your ancestors and so on and so forth. And the memory that we hold within the body is so great. So if we absorb it, it's almost like a literal truth, isn't it? In every cell, there's going to be ability to hold memory. Every cell, net, every atom.
I remember in a previous episode, we were talking about the Bhagavad Gita verse where Krishna talks about the yogi that focuses on developing his intellect, or jnana yoga, versus just the yogi who practices, kriya, and essentially they reach the same. Both of them reach each other's level of elevation. So as kriya yoga, if we just perfect our kriya, then all the jnana that's required will come to us, and vice versa. And here this is just written in a different way, isn't it? Wisdom is not assimilated with the eyes, but with the atoms. So with kriya, with every kriya, you could say that a book is being downloaded in terms of a book of knowledge. But if I was going back to the previous line, if I was to ask you, have you read the Gita, or do you know the Gita, Michael? Before this episode that we were going to, if I'd asked you, what would you have said?
Yeah, I mean, to my defense, I have to say I've read this chapter before, and I'm very humble about my knowledge of the Gita, rightfully so. I wouldn't have told you, especially you, because you have read the Gita a lot more than I did. So I would not have started bragging about my Gita knowledge to you, Brian.
Lauren, what would you have said? Lauren, do you know the Gita?
No, I know of the Gita, and I've read a little bit of the Gita, but in truth, no, I don't. I would love to read all of the Gita and actually absorb it, right? But I haven't made it past the first half. I sort of dipped in and out, but yeah. So the answer, Priyank, is no.
Chris, do you know the Gita?
So we read the Gita, right? We have like a Gita reading group, and we sort of take turns. And now we've been doing that for a while. I don't know how long, a couple of years or more. You kicked it off, Priyank, which was nice. And I'm baffled every time that I read it, how baffled I am by it. I'm baffled by the baffledness. I'm just constantly almost intimidated by the depths of the knowledge in the Gita. It's depths I don't think I'm yet able to swim in, for sure.
I've started this related to that. I've started just writing out my favorite verses again and again. Just the verses themselves, not all the texts, just to try and get a bit further in my understanding of it.
It's like if you've ever been, in the ocean or been somewhere where there's deep water, you kind of look down. You get a little bit scared because it's just this bottomless ocean. It's sort of how I feel about the Gita. Sometimes my ego trembles a little bit whenever I open up, like, oh gosh, there's so much in here that I don't know, can't understand.
Yeah, and it also says that Sri Yukteswar then directed his own disciples using this same method of one-pointedness in terms of learning. But I remember someone once at the center complimented the four of us and said, "Oh, you four of you have got so much knowledge. How do you remember all these things, and how do you bring out all the different parts of the teachings?" And I said, that's completely false advertising, because That's not what we do. Before every single episode, each of us spends about a week, whoever leads it spends at least a week thinking about all the different facets of Guruji's teachings and what's relevant and bringing it into the conversation. So listeners, sorry to ruin the parade, but we have no more knowledge than the rest of.
That's good. We're all about truth here, right? Rip off the veil. Yeah.
So, Priyank, if Dabru Balav would have asked you if you know Gita, what would you have answered?
I would have said I'm trying.
Do you think he would have smiled at you?
I would have been smiling.
And trying.
It was like a really profound question. And, oh my gosh, do I have grace?
No, it's all good fun here. Yeah. So he, Yukteswar, he continues after the sentence where he says it's not assimilated with the eyes, but with the atoms. He then says, when your conviction of truth is not merely in your brain, but in your whole being, or he just says in your being, you may diffidently vouch for its meaning. So that means you have to really own the knowledge. Yes, Lauren?
I love this line. I think it's got to be probably one of my favorites in the autobiography. It's just, I feel like it's quite relatable in a certain way. Like, I'm sure each one of us has kind of felt that inner conviction for something in our lives, whatever it was, of like, yes, this is true. And it's not just true in your brain. You don't intellectually know it to be true, but in your being, you know that, yeah, this is right, or this is the thing. And I really love this for that, and the reminder of it's not enough to know it in your head, but actually you've got to know it in your whole being and live it, right, and live it authentically and feel that truth as yourself. Yeah.
What do we think he's referring to here? Your being. If you were to say, like, hit us with the definition, or what is? Because when I think about it, like your whole being, we're talking about, the soul, the fraction of the infinite, or we're talking about, all the bodies. Like, what would you sort of leaves it up into interpretation a little bit? Is it your physical being? Is it all your beings, or the five, the astral, the causal? Is it some kind of harmony within them? I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's also answered in the previous line where we said wisdom is not assimilated with the eyes, but with the atoms. So when it's the same as the point again we were making about the Kriya, doing it properly and assimilating intuitive knowledge and experience through that process as well, and then keep doing it, and then hopefully it enters your being, and then you can say that you understand something intuitively.
So
not satisfied. Chris is not satisfied.
It's funny because I use the word with all my being. I've used that word. How many times have we said that, throughout our lives? Actually, what is it actually I would actually mean by that? Because I kind of get it. I get it a nod and think, yeah, might be all my being, but yeah, I suppose we're talking about.
Can you say it for when you last said it? I'm sure it's for dramatic effect rather than soul perceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hence the incorrect usage of all my being.
Yeah. It's something we all intuitively know, and that intuition comes from the higher self, right? Which in itself, higher being.
Yeah, we have a lot of sayings that kind of reveal how we think about the world without even saying it, really, right? So this, I think, is one of them. I like that one. There is a section in Divine Romance. It's called The Mind, Repository of Infinite Power, where Guruji talks about book learning and absorbing knowledge. Chris, do you want to start reading that?
Yeah. So the mind, repository of infinite power. The Western point of view is that knowledge of God can be received through book learning. But one defect in this approach is that every study should have a practical as well as a theoretical side. You can acquire a mental concept from a story you read in a book, but its practical value in daily life remains to be seen. All too often, the intellect becomes satisfied with just a theory about God. Great and glorious is the story of God's presence, but greater and more glorious is the actual perception of the infinite.
I speak only of what I have experienced. For personal experience is the practical aspect of religion. If you practice 1/1,000,000th of the things that I tell you in these Thursday night meetings, you will reach God. Success doesn't lie in listening to my sermons, but in practicing what I have told you. Today you will learn how to develop the seeds of your innate God-given faculties of the mind.
This was, of course, a lecture that Yogananda gave on a Thursday, I'm guessing. But it really brings home the point that the learning the scriptures, memorizing them, is not the goal. But like you mentioned earlier, Priyank, it's really the Raja Yoga, the Kriya that will actually get us to God realization. And that's really the good news, right? So we learned that there's this technique to really absorb knowledge from the great scriptures like the Gita. But Sri Yukteswar says here that, or Yogananda says that Sri Yukteswar taught that this is not really necessary for self-realization. You can do that. It inspires you. It creates. It is recommended. But really, to become self-realized, you don't have to absorb all the knowledge of the Gita. You really have to practice Kriya Yoga and devotion. That's really the important part of it, of your sadhana. And he keeps going. He says that the rishis, they wrote a lot of those profundities over generations. But he says the endless literary controversies for sluggard minds. What more quickly liberating thought than God is? Then he says, nay, God. And he really says it's about simplicity, but this is not something that is intuitive to man who seek God.
This, where he says the rishis wrote in one sentence profundities that commentating scholars busy themselves over for generations. Do you think we classify in the category of the latter, commentating scholars, because we're spending heaven only knows how long on each line or paragraph of this, but we're not doing it for the sake of scholarly pursuits, are we?
Yes.
I don't think any university is going to give us honorary doctorates because of this great podcast work, are they, Chris?
I can put this on my CV. So that's the whole purpose of it. Yeah. Well, that's just it. It's like a conscious meditation. And the same thing as you mentioned about going through the lessons line by line. Why there's lesson groups, and really helps to break down and digest it in ways. Thankfully, we're not reciting anything here. Come to say it comes from our own knowledge bank.
What is a sluggard mind? Does anyone know? Sluggard just means lazy and sluggish, slow, essentially. But I didn't really understand. I didn't understand what this sentence meant.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the sentence. Yeah. Anyone know? Endless literary controversy is for sluggard minds. Because literary controversy and debating it takes energy and effort. Then why is that? Why does that sluggard? I don't know.
Maybe it means like if you're more interested in just speaking about it, you're lazy in your mind because you're not actually using your mind and the power of the mind to understand it. You're just talking about it. So it's quite like lazy in terms of its surface level approach, perhaps.
Listeners.
Definitely one for listeners.
Yeah.
Because but I think what he does emphasize here is that it's not the right way. So if he said for the sluggard mind, I don't think we all think we got the sluggard mind or we want to have. So it's not what he wants us to do, I would say.
And the next line is really interesting, isn't it? So kind of answers the question what the sluggard minds are. I.e., the antidote is what is more liberating thought than God is. And then it goes even simpler. It says, nay, God. And then one is reminded of Guruji's poem, God, 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 which is reading that in itself is a meditation. But Sri Yukteswar here beautifully talks about just going down to like crux of learning. I just focus on the word God, and you can repeat the word God and take that into gain samadhi just through thought of that word and what that word means and the experience of that word.
He says the intellectualist he tends to go to, he calls it learned pomposities rather than simplicity. So I think the way he says it is that it's really just there to please the ego, but it's not really valuable on our way to self-realization. So this is the summary of it. We really need to be focusing on the simple concept of God and not to memorize large texts and then quote them later on to kind of make our ego happy. But it's really about what gets us closer to God. Yeah, I like that sentence where he says, God is, and then no, not even that, just God, just that one thought. And a lot of times when we practice japa yoga, we just repeat his name or the name of a god, right? And this is all we focus on, and somehow this gets us into a deeper state. So this is really the way to progress on the spiritual path.
Remember an extreme example of learned pomposities. I used to watch this religious channel in India called Asta, and back then there was this. Oh no, it wasn't on Asta. It was another Islamic channel actually, and there was this Islamic doctor called Dr. Zakir Naik, who then became very controversial and got ousted from India. But he used to host these public debates, and there would be thousands of people that would go to them, and anyone would be invited to ask a question on any topic, and he would just quote all the scriptures, literally like all the big scriptures, the Rig Veda, the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, anything. He'd quote it just and say the verse that it's from, and then say the similar verse that's in the Quran, and then say why Quran's one is superior because whatever he used to justify it, and he used to do it so eloquently. and similarly with the Bible and with any of the Judaic texts, and he used to just revert everything back to Islam, but he did it with such flair that it was quite fun just watching how much flair he used to do it with. But obviously it incited a lot of religious divisions and hatred, because indirectly he was criticizing all the other religions, and then it got linked to terrorism and things like that. So he got ousted from India. But he used to do it with so much flair. And this is this is the danger, isn't it? Is what Yogananda is referring to here, and so Sri Yukteswar. His ego is pleased that he can grasp such eruditions. But ego may be pleased, but the soul not so.
I guess it's also a good lesson, what you just mentioned, Priyank, for the spectator, that we shouldn't look for someone who looks like the wisest scholar, but someone who looks like someone who has put those teachings into practice and really reach God. Hard to know, of course, but that's what we should be looking for. Might not be the person who quotes the most scriptures. Might be someone else. Yeah. I think we've done justice to part 18, and we can have a quick sneak peek at part 19, Lauren.
Well, speaking of ego, we meet someone in the next part who comes with a fair amount of ego. I think that's fair to say. A local magistrate turns up at Sri Yukteswar's hermitage, and he's quite an important figure. So Guruji is naturally quite fearful of his presence, and potentially Sri Yukteswar upsetting him and then losing the hermitage. So the magistrate comes in, and him and Sri Yukteswar get in a discussion, and it becomes very heated, and we become faced with a lot of pride, a lot of anger, and then an interesting turn of events happens at the end of that part, which shall be revealed next time.
Or if you can't wait that long, just read the next.
Yeah, just read the next part. I'm sure everyone's read it anyway.
No, I read it just recently, but I couldn't think of what you're referring to. So I'm now going to read
it again.
There you go. Priyank can't wait till next week.
And Priyank, just look at it for half an hour and then meditate for an hour. Don't just read.
Indeed.
Yeah, so the excitement is building. Can't wait for the next episode. Thank you to the listener, to the viewers on YouTube. And thank you, Priyank, Lauren, and Chris. Jai Guru.
Sure.